The mid-afternoon sun hung heavy over the manicured lawns of Whitby Manor, a golden haze that felt more like a cage than a blessing to Clara. While the elite of the ton paraded in their finest silks, their laughter chiming like brittle glass against the porcelain tea sets, Clara moved through the periphery like a ghost in faded muslin. She was the family's greatest secret and their most convenient servant, a girl whose high cheekbones and wide, intelligent eyes were hidden beneath a frayed bonnet and the shadow of her sister's flamboyant successes. For Lady Millicent, Clara was a reminder of a previous marriage that should be forgotten, a stain on the pristine white tablecloth of her social ambitions. Seeking a moment's reprieve from the relentless demands of carrying trays and smoothing linens, Clara ducked behind the towering rows of blooming hydrangeas. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and crushed petals. It was in this secluded sanctuary that she heard it, a faint, rhythmic whimpering that broke her heart. Tucked beneath a tangled briar was a creature that looked as out of place as she did, a tiny Maltese puppy, its white fur matted with dirt and stickers. It was shivering, a fragile puff of life lost in the vastness of the estate. "Oh, you poor little thing," Clara whispered, her voice a soft melody that hadn't been used for anything but, yes, stepmother for years. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and the puppy didn't flee. Instead, it licked her palm with a desperate, frantic heat. As she gathered the small dog, whom she instinctively named Atlas, into her arms, a rare, genuine smile transformed her face. In that moment, holding the creature against her chest and feeling the rapid beat of its tiny heart, she felt a spark of connection that the cold halls of Whitby Manor had never provided. But the warmth was short-lived. A shadow, sharp and jagged, fell across the grass, extinguishing the sunlight. "So, this is where the help has crawled off to." The voice was like a lash. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up into the icy, narrowed eyes of Lady Millicent. Her stepmother stood there, resplendent in emerald silk that seemed to pulse with her barely contained fury. To Millicent, Clara's presence at the garden party was an eyesore. But to find her kneeling in the dirt, clutching a hasarmed, filthy street beast, while the Duke of Rothbury was rumored to be walking the grounds, was an unforgivable transgression. I found him in the briars, ma'am," Clara stammered, pulling Atlas closer as the puppy let out a soft, frightened yip. "He's hurt. I was only going to—" "You were going to embarrass this family yet again," Millicent hissed, her face contorting into a mask of aristocratic rage. "Look at you. Filth on your hem, your hair a bird's nest, and clutching a mangy cur like some common beggar. Do you have any idea who is in attendance today? The Duke is here, Duke is, and you stand there looking like a scullery maid's mistake." "Please, he's just a puppy," Clara pleaded, her voice cracking. "Give it to me," Millicent demanded, reaching out with claw-like fingers. "I'll have the groundskeeper drown the wretched thing before it brings fleas into my house." Clara recoiled, her eyes widening in horror. "No, I won't let you." The defiance, however small, was the final spark. Lady Millicent's face went white with shock, then turned a terrifying shade of crimson. "You dare? You dare speak back to me after I have fed you and housed you out of the charity of my heart?" Millicent's hand flew up, the silk of her sleeve whistling through the air as she prepared to deliver a blow meant to break Clara's spirit once and for all. Clara winced, squeezing her eyes shut and curling her body around Atlas, bracing for the sting of the slap she had felt so many times before. The blow never landed. Instead, there was a sharp, audible gasp from Millicent and the sound of a heavy, muffled thud. Clara waited for the pain, but all she felt was the sudden stillness of the garden, as if the birds themselves had stopped singing in anticipation. Slowly, Clara opened her eyes. A man stood between her and her tormentor. He was tall, impossibly so, with shoulders that seemed to block out the very sun. He wore a coat of midnight blue that fit with military precision, but it was his face that arrested her breath. It was a face carved from granite, handsome in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. His dark eyes were fixed on Lady Millicent with a look of such profound, freezing disdain that the older woman seemed to shrink within her emerald silks. His gloved hand was clamped firmly around Millicent's wrist, holding it mid-air with the effortless strength of a predator. "I was under the impression, Lady Whitby, that this was a garden party meant to celebrate the beauty of the season," the man said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in Clara's chest, smooth as velvet, yet edged with the sharpness of a razor. "I did not realize the entertainment included the public battery of a young woman." "Your Grace!" Millicent gasped, her voice trembling as she struggled to find her composure. You don't understand. This girl she is my stepdaughter, and she has been most—" "I understand perfectly," the Duke of Rothbury interrupted, his grip tightening just enough to make Millicent wince. He didn't look at the stepmother as he spoke. His gaze shifted downward, falling upon Clara. For the first time in her life, Clara felt truly seen, not as a servant, not as a burden, but as a person. The Duke's eyes softened for the briefest of seconds as they landed on the shivering Maltese puppy in her arms, then returned to the girl who had been willing to take a blow to protect it. "Release her," the Duke commanded. And though he was the one holding Millicent, it was clear he was speaking of the invisible chains that held Clara to this family. He let go of Millicent's wrist as if it were something unclean and stepped closer to Clara. The power dynamic of the Whitby garden party didn't just shift, it shattered. In the silence that followed, as the Duke reached out a hand to help Clara rise from the dirt, the world seemed to narrow down to just the three of them. The girl, the puppy, and the man who had decided, on a whim of justice, to change their fates forever. My beautiful family. Before we dive into this interesting story, I need to share something important with you. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and right now, there are only limited spots to be among our founding 1,000. Our inner circle who were here from the beginning. And I want you to be among our most cherished first 1,000. These first 1,000 subscribers will always hold a special place in this community. You'll be the ones who believed in these stories when we were just starting out. The ones who helped build something beautiful. But here's the thing. Once we hit that milestone, that opportunity closes forever. You'll still be welcome, but you won't be part of that exclusive founding group who shaped this channel's journey. So if you've been watching without subscribing, now is your moment. Don't let this story end without you being part of our family. And tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's get into the story. The silence that followed the Duke's intervention was absolute. A vacuum that sucked the very air from the sprawling gardens. Arthur Crane did not release his gaze from Lady Millicent, though his physical grip on her had vanished. He stood with a terrifying, predator-like stillness, his presence dwarfing the woman who, only moments before, had seemed like the undisputed queen of the Whitby estate. Lady Millicent's chest heaved, her emerald silk rustling with the frantic rhythm of her heart. She looked around, realizing with a jolt of horror that the high society guests, the counts, the marchionesses, and the gossips she had spent years cultivating were all staring. The Duke of Rothbury had not merely stopped a family dispute, he had pulled back the curtain on the rot beneath the Whitby polish. "Your Grace," Millicent managed, her voice a thin, reedy thing. She attempted a shaky laugh that died in her throat. "You must forgive the display. The girl she is high-spirited. She lacks the discipline required of a lady. You were merely demonstrating why the name Whitby is whispered with such distaste in circles that actually value character," Arthur interrupted. His voice wasn't raised, yet it carried to the edge of the hydrangea bushes where several debutantes stood frozen. "To strike a woman is the mark of a coward. To strike one who is under your protection is the mark of a tyrant. I find I have very little patience for either." Clara looked up, her vision blurred by unshed tears. She saw the Duke's profile, the sharp, uncompromising line of his jaw, and the way the sunlight caught the dark depths of his eyes. He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the frost in his expression thawed into something approaching concern. "Stand up, Miss Whitby," he said softly. Clara moved to obey, but her legs felt like water. She stumbled, still clutching Atlas to her chest, and felt a strong, steadying hand catch her elbow. The touch was electric, a firm anchor in the midst of her crumbling world. Arthur didn't just help her up. He placed himself firmly between her and her stepmother, a living shield of midnight blue and iron will. Millicent found her tongue again, fueled by a desperate need to reclaim her status. "She is my ward, Your Grace. By the laws of this land and the will of her late father, she belongs under this roof. You cannot simply walk into a man's garden and—" "Her father is dead, and the man currently holding the title is a drunkard who has gambled away half your dowry if the rumors at White's are to be believed," Arthur said, his words cutting through Millicent's protest like a guillotine. He turned his head slightly, addressing the crowd of onlookers without ever fully taking his eyes off his prey. "It seems the air of Whitby Manor is toxic. It stifles growth and rewards cruelty. I believe a change of scenery is not only invited, but required." "You cannot take her," Millicent shrieked, her poise finally shattering. Arthur Crane stepped forward, a single pace that forced Millicent to retreat. The power he radiated was palpable, the kind of authority that came from centuries of lineage and a personal code that refused to bend. "I am the Duke of Rothbury. I can do many things that common men cannot. And protecting a lady from a common bully is at the very top of that list." He turned fully to Clara then. The tiny Maltese puppy in her arms poked its head out from her grasp, its dark eyes reflecting the Duke's formidable image. "Miss Whitby," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a tone that was for her alone. "Do you wish to stay here? Do you wish to remain in a house where your kindness is treated as a flaw, and your person is subject to the whims of a woman who does not know your worth?" Clara looked at Lady Millicent. She saw the venom in the woman's eyes, the promise of 1,000 miseries to be paid back tenfold once the guests had departed. Then she looked at the Duke. He was a stranger, a man of cold reputation and immense power. But in his eyes, she saw the first spark of justice she had encountered in a decade. "No," Clara whispered, her voice gaining strength as the word left her lips. "I do not wish to stay." "Then you shall not," Arthur declared. He didn't wait for Millicent's permission, nor did he offer a parting bow. He reached down and took the small bundle of matted white fur from Clara's arms, tucking Atlas into the crook of his own powerful arm with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his stature. With his other hand, he offered his arm to Clara. "Come," he said. "The carriage is waiting at the front gates. You will leave this place today." "But her things, her reputation!" Millicent cried out, realizing she was losing her most valuable servant and her favorite scapegoat in one stroke. "This is a scandal. The Ton will never forget this." Arthur stopped and looked back over his shoulder, his expression one of bored finality. "Let them talk, Lady Whitby. They will be talking about your disgrace, not hers. And as for her things, nothing in this house is worthy of the woman she is about to become." Clara placed her hand on the Duke's sleeve. The fine wool felt expensive beneath her calloused fingers, a stark contrast to the rough muslin of her own dress. As they walked away, leaving the stunned crowd and the fuming Lady Millicent behind, Clara felt a strange sensation in her chest. For the first time in her life, the weight she carried didn't feel like a burden. They walked through the garden, past the fountain where her sisters were staring in open-mouthed shock, and through the iron gates that had felt like the bars of a cell for so long. Outside, a magnificent black carriage with the Rothbury crest stood waiting, the horses stamping their hooves with impatience. Arthur handed Atlas back to her as the footman opened the door. He paused, looking at the house one last time before helping her inside. "You are safe now, Clara," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like a promise. As the carriage pulled away, leaving the dust of Whitby Manor in its wake, Clara sank into the velvet cushions. She held Atlas close, feeling the puppy's heartbeat steadying against her own. She was a girl with no dowry, a stained dress, and a stray dog, riding in the carriage of the most powerful man in England. The world she knew was gone, and though she was terrified of the unknown, for the first time in her 20 years, she breathed air that didn't taste of fear. The Duke sat opposite her, his dark eyes watching the passing countryside. A silent sentinel who had just declared war on her past to secure her future. The heavy iron gates of Whitby Manor ground shut with a finality that echoed through the quiet valley. The metallic clang sounding to Clara's ears like the closing of a tomb she had finally escaped. Inside the plush, rhythmic swaying of the Rothbury carriage, the air was different. It smelled of expensive tobacco, aged leather, and the faint, crisp scent of cedar that clung to the Duke's heavy wool coat. The garment was still draped over her shoulders, its weight immense and warm, shielding her from the curious, judging eyes of the neighbors who had peered through their curtains as the Duke's black horses thundered past. Clara sat huddled in the corner of the velvet bench, her fingers buried deep in Atlas's white fur. The puppy had finally stopped shivering, lulled into a wary sleep by the vibration of the wheels against the cobblestones. She dared not look directly at the man sitting opposite her. Arthur Crane was a silhouette of silent power against the passing sunset, his gaze fixed on the rolling hills of the Kent countryside. He looked as though he had just concluded a minor business transaction rather than abducted a nobleman's stepdaughter in broad daylight. "You have left everything behind," he said suddenly. His voice was low, devoid of the sharp edge he had used against Lady Millicent, yet it still commanded the space between them. Clara finally looked up, her gaze catching on the silver ducal crest embroidered on the carriage door. "There was nothing there that was truly mine, Your Grace. Only memories I would prefer to lose in the dust." She thought of her small, drafty room in the attic, the threadbare blankets, and the single dried rose she had kept from her father's funeral. She had left without a trunk, without a spare shift, and without a single farthing to her name. She owned only the clothes on her back, now ruined by garden soil and the small, breathing life in her lap. It was a terrifying realization, to be so utterly untethered from the world. "A wise perspective," Arthur remarked, turning his head to observe her. His dark eyes traced the line of her jaw, noting the smudge of dirt on her cheek and the way she held the dog, as if it were the only anchor in a storm. Most women of your station would be hysterical at the thought of a ruined reputation. You, however, seem to be breathing more freely than you were an hour ago. Reputation is a luxury for those who are loved, Your Grace. Clara replied softly, her voice gaining a trace of the iron she had hidden for so long. In that house, my reputation was merely a tool for my stepmother to sharpen. I would rather be a fallen woman in a warm coat than a virtuous servant in a cold kitchen. A ghost of a smile flitted across the Duke's stern features, a brief, lightning flash of amusement that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He reached into a hidden compartment in the carriage wall and pulled out a small, silk-wrapped parcel, offering it to her. Eat. We will not reach Rothbury until late, and you look as though a strong wind might carry you off. Inside the silk were delicate biscuits and dried fruit, luxuries Clara usually only saw on the trays she carried to her sisters. She hesitated, her stomach giving a traitorous growl. With a nod of thanks, she took a piece, breaking off a tiny crumb for Atlas, who woke instantly and began to nibble at her fingertips. The Duke watched the interaction with an unreadable expression. The dog is a Maltese, a breed of antiquity and loyalty. It seems fitting that he found you. I think we found each other, Clara whispered. He was hiding from the noise, and so was I. As the twilight deepened into a bruised purple, the carriage began to climb. The well-manicured hedges of the neighboring estates gave way to ancient oaks and wilder, more rugged terrain. This was the edge of the Duke's vast holdings, a territory where his word was the only law that mattered. Clara felt the shift in the atmosphere, a sense of entering a fortress. For hours, the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the horses and the occasional sigh from the puppy. Clara found her eyes growing heavy. The sheer exhaustion of years of servitude, capped by the adrenaline of the afternoon's trauma, was finally taking its toll. Her head began to nod, slipping toward the window. She felt a gloved hand gently catch her shoulder, guiding her away from the hard glass. "Sleep, Miss Whitby," Arthur said, his voice sounding as if it were coming from a great distance. "The gates of Rothbury are guarded by more than just stone. No one will hurt you there. Not the law, not your kin, and certainly not the woman who dared raise a hand to you." In the half-light of the carriage, Clara let her eyes close. She felt the warmth of his coat, the softness of the puppy's fur, and for the first time in her adult life, the profound, intoxicating sense of being protected. She was leaving the only world she had ever known, heading toward a destination she couldn't imagine, guided by a man the world called cold and heartless. Yet, as sleep finally claimed her, Clara didn't feel like a captive. She felt like a bird that had finally found the strength to fly, even if she was flying straight into the heart of a thunderstorm. The carriage rolled on into the night, a lone black shadow moving through the forest, carrying a girl who had nothing and a duke who intended to give her everything, whether the world allowed it or not. The wheels of the carriage transitioned from the rough grit of the main road to the smooth, rhythmic crunch of crushed limestone as they entered the primary drive of Rothbury Hall. The sound woke Clara from her fitful slumber. Blinking against the darkness, she realized the carriage had slowed to a stately crawl. Outside the window, a forest of ancient, silver-barked oaks gave way to vast, undulating lawns that seemed to glow under the pale light of a rising moon. In the distance, Rothbury Hall rose like a mountain of pale stone against the obsidian sky. It was a masterpiece of Palladian architecture, its rows of glowing windows looking like embers set into a cliffside. Unlike the cramped, desperate opulence of Whitby Manor, where every gilded chair felt like a threat to one's composure. Rothbury radiated a silent, immovable permanence. It was a place that did not need to scream its wealth. It simply existed as an undeniable fact of the earth. As the carriage pulled into the massive circular courtyard, the Duke's coat slipped slightly from Clara's shoulders. She reached to catch it, her heart beginning a frantic staccato. She looked at Arthur Crane. He was watching her, his expression unreadable in the shadows, but his posture remained relaxed. "The transition will be jarring, Miss Whitby," he said, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "But you must remember one thing. Within these walls, your word carries the weight of my own. My staff knows this. You would do well to learn it too." Before she could ask what he meant, the carriage door was swept open by a footman in impeccable livery of deep navy and silver. He didn't sneer at Clara's dirt-streaked face or the small, yawning dog in her arms. Instead, he bowed low, his eyes fixed respectfully on the ground. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the footman murmured. "Welcome to Rothbury, miss." Arthur stepped out first, offering his hand to Clara. As she descended, the sheer scale of the entrance hall took her breath away. The doors were towering slabs of carved mahogany, opening into a foyer of black and white marble that stretched upward toward a domed ceiling painted with celestial maps. Standing in a precise line were the senior members of the household staff. At the head of the line stood a woman of advanced years, her silver hair pulled into a sharp, efficient knot, her black silk dress rustling as she stepped forward. This was Mrs. Halloway, the housekeeper whose reputation for discipline was legendary across the county. Clara braced herself for the cold appraisal she usually received from those in authority. She expected to be sent to the kitchens, or perhaps the laundry, to be scrubbed clean of her shame. Instead, Mrs. Halloway curtsied so deeply that the hem of her gown brushed the marble. "We have prepared the blue suite for the young lady, Your Grace," Mrs. Halloway said, her voice warm and steady. She turned her gaze to Clara, and to Clara's shock, there was no judgment, only a profound, quiet kindness. "It is a pleasure to have you with us, Miss Whitby. I have taken the liberty of warming the rooms and preparing a light supper. And I see we have a small guest as well." Clara looked down at Atlas, who was peering out from her arms with wide, curious eyes. "His name is Atlas," she whispered, her voice trembling. I am sorry for the mess. I didn't mean to bring dirt into such a beautiful place." "Nonsense, child," Mrs. Halloway replied, stepping closer and reaching out a hand as if to pat Clara's arm before recollecting herself. "A bit of the earth is easily swept away. A weary spirit, however, requires more care. If you will follow me, I shall show you to your quarters." Arthur remained by the hearth, where a footman was already coaxing a fire into life. He watched as the housekeeper led Clara toward the grand staircase. "Mrs. Halloway," he called out. The woman stopped and turned. "See to it that a veterinarian is summoned first thing in the morning to look over the dog, and ensure the seamstress arrives by noon." "Of course, Your Grace." As Clara climbed the stairs, her hands skimming the cool, polished mahogany of the banister, she felt as though she were walking through a dream. They passed galleries lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but the atmosphere didn't feel oppressive. It felt protective. When Mrs. Halloway opened the doors to the blue suite, Clara stopped in the doorway. It was a room larger than the entire ground floor of her father's cottage. The walls were hung with pale blue damask, and a massive four-poster bed stood draped in cream silk. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a flickering orange light over a table set with silver domed dishes and a crystal carafe of water. A bath has been drawn in the dressing room, Mrs. Halloway said softly. I have laid out a nightgown. It is a bit simple, I fear, as we had to borrow it from one of the younger maids. But it is clean and soft. Thank you, Clara said, her eyes stinging. She looked at the elderly woman, her confusion finally boiling over. Why is everyone being so kind? I am nobody, I have no dowry. My stepmother says I am a blight. Mrs. Halloway's expression hardened for a moment, not at Clara, but at the thought of the woman who had uttered such lies. She walked over to Clara and took Atlas from her arms, cradling the puppy with practiced ease. Miss Whitby, the Duke of Rothbury does not bring blights into his home. He is a man of singular judgment. If he has brought you here, it is because he sees something in you that the rest of the world was too blind to notice. In this house, we do not look at what a person lacks. We look at who they are. And right now, you are a guest of the Duke. That makes you more important than any duchess in London, as far as we are concerned. For the first time in 10 years, Clara felt the tension in her shoulders begin to dissolve. She allowed the maids to help her from her ruined muslin, the warm water of the bath soaking away the grime of the Whitby gardens and the sting of her stepmother's shadow. Later, tucked into the immense bed with Atlas curled into a ball at her feet, Clara watched the embers of the fire die down. The silence of Rothbury was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a prison, but the deep, restful quiet of a sanctuary. She was a stranger in a kingdom of stone and silk, guarded by a man she barely knew, yet as she drifted into a dreamless sleep, she knew she had finally found the one thing she had stopped praying for, a place where she was allowed to simply be. The morning sun at Rothbury Hall did not intrude. It arrived with a gentle, golden persistence, illuminating the blue damask walls of Clara's suite and catching the frantic, joyful wagging of Atlas's tail. For the first time in a decade, Clara woke without the heavy dread of a bell summoning her to labor. Instead, there was a soft knock at the door, and a parade of housemaids entered, carrying steaming pitchers of scented water and a breakfast tray that smelled of fresh honey and toasted oats. By noon, the quiet sanctuary of her room was transformed into a whirlwind of silk, lace, and measuring tapes. Madame Genevieve, the most sought-after modiste in the county, had arrived on the Duke's express command, bringing with her bolts of fabric that shimmered like captured moonlight and velvet the color of a midnight sky. "Arms up, chérie," the modiste commanded, her French accent thick and authoritative as she draped a length of seafoam silk against Clara's skin. Such porcelain skin. It has been hidden under rags for too long. We shall make you a vision that will make the angels weep with envy. Clara stood on a low pedestal, feeling like a statue being carved into something new. She watched her reflection in the full-length cheval glass, barely recognizing the woman looking back. The dark circles under her eyes had begun to fade, and her hair, washed and brushed until it shone like chestnut silk, cascaded over her shoulders. Yet, as the pins were tucked and the laces tightened, a flicker of the old fear returned. She felt like an imposter, a servant playing dress-up in a duke's playhouse. A sudden hush fell over the room. Madame Genevieve dropped a deep curtsy, and the maids scurried to the corners like frightened mice. Clara turned to see Arthur Crane standing in the doorway. He had shed his formal traveling coat for a simpler waistcoat of dark charcoal, but his presence was no less commanding. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling on Clara. The intensity of his gaze made the breath catch in her throat. "Progress, madame?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "More than progress, your grace. the modiste chirped, gesturing dramatically toward Clara. "We are uncovering a masterpiece. But the young lady, she is hesitant. She chooses the muted grays and the browns. She wishes to hide." Arthur stepped into the room, his boots clicking softly on the polished wood. He walked a slow circle around the pedestal, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. She felt exposed, not because of the unfinished gown, but because he seemed to be looking directly at the soul she had kept guarded for so long. "Gray is for shadows, madame," Arthur said quietly, stopping directly in front of Clara. "Miss Whitby is finished with shadows." He reached out, his gloved fingers lifting a swatch of deep, regal crimson from a nearby table. He held it up against her cheek. The color was bold, defiant, and breathtaking. "This," he commanded, "and the sapphire silk we discussed. I want nothing that suggests she is a guest on sufferance. She is to be dressed as the mistress of her own fate." "Your Grace," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as the modiste scurried away to gather the requested fabrics. "This is too much. The cost alone, I can never repay you. I feel as though I am wearing a mask." Arthur stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the faint, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and rain that followed him. He reached out, not to touch her skin, but to lift a stray lock of hair that had fallen across her brow. His touch was light, almost reverent. "You have spent your life believing that your value is measured by how much of yourself you can give away," he said, his voice dropping to a private, intimate register. "You think these gowns are a disguise. They are not. They are simply the frame for the portrait that has been there all along. You are not a servant, Clara. You never were. You were merely a diamond kept in a coal cellar." Clara looked into his eyes and saw a reflection of herself she didn't yet trust, a woman of grace, beauty, and untapped power. "And what happens when the portrait is finished?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What does a duke do with a girl he rescued from a garden?" Arthur's gaze intensified, a brief, hungry flame flickering in the dark depths of his eyes before he masked it with his usual stoicism. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down and picked up Atlas, who had been nipping playfully at the hem of his trousers. The puppy licked the Duke's thumb, and Arthur offered a rare, genuine smile that softened the harsh lines of his face. "He watches her find her wings," he said finally, "and he discovers, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some things are worth protecting, not because of duty, but because they are precious." He handed the dog back to her, his hand lingering against hers for a second longer than necessary. The warmth of the contact sent a shiver through Clara that had nothing to do with the drafty room. "The seamstresses will stay as long as needed," Arthur announced to the room at large, his voice regaining its ducal authority. "By the time we host the hunt breakfast next week, I expect Miss Whitby to be the most radiant woman in the county. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," the modiste beamed. As Arthur turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back over his shoulder. "Wear the crimson for dinner tonight, Clara. I wish to see the sun rise in the middle of the evening." When the door closed behind him, the room felt suddenly colder, yet Clara's heart was racing with a heat she had never known. She looked back at the mirror. The girl in the faded muslin was gone, replaced by a woman wrapped in silks, and the burgeoning realization that the Duke wasn't just fitting her for gowns. He was fitting her for a life she had never dared to dream of. She touched the crimson fabric, and for the first time, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like a woman who was finally being seen. The following week at Rothbury Hall settled into a rhythm that felt less like a guest's visit and more like a slow, deliberate weaving of two disparate lives. While the grand house continued its clockwork operations, the true heart of the estate seemed to migrate toward the sun-drenched morning room and the private gardens, centered around the smallest and most energetic of its inhabitants. Atlas, no longer the shivering scrap of fur Clara had rescued, had become a whirlwind of white fluff and boundless curiosity, his presence acting as a persistent challenge to the Duke's carefully maintained stoicism. It began on a Tuesday afternoon when a sudden, violent spring thunderstorm rolled across the hills, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. Clara was in the library, attempting to focus on a volume of poetry, when a crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the house. Atlas, terrified by the roar, bolted from her lap and disappeared into the labyrinth of the ground floor. Distraught, Clara searched the corridors, her calls growing increasingly frantic as the rain lashed against the tall windows. She finally found him in the one place she feared to intrude, Arthur's private study. The door was ajar, and as she peered inside, the sight that met her eyes caused her to stop mid-breath. The Duke of Rothbury, the man who commanded thousands and made seasoned politicians stammer, was kneeling on the Persian rug before his massive oak desk. He had discarded his cravat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing forearms that spoke of a life more active than mere paperwork. Tucked securely into the crook of his arm was Atlas, the puppy trembling and burying his head in the crook of the Duke's elbow. Arthur was speaking, but the voice wasn't the sharp, authoritative baritone Clara knew. It was a low, rhythmic hum, a soothing vibration that seemed to anchor the frightened animal. "I am sorry, Your Grace," Clara whispered, stepping into the room. "The thunder. He's never heard it before." Arthur looked up, but he didn't rise. The firelight reflected in his eyes, making them appear softer, warmer. "There is no need for apologies, Clara. Fear is not a choice, though most of the world treats it as a character flaw." He reached out his free hand, stroking the puppy's ears with a surprising gentleness. "He reminded me of something I once lost. A hound I had as a boy. He hated the storms, too." Clara crossed the room and sat on the low ottoman near the hearth, watching the way Arthur's large hand completely covered the puppy's back. "You don't seem like a man who was ever allowed to be afraid," she remarked, her voice soft. "I wasn't," Arthur admitted, his gaze returning to the dog. "A duke is taught to be a fortress. But even fortresses have dungeons where they hide the things they cannot control. This little creature, he has no dungeons. He simply feels, and he expects the world to answer his need." For an hour, they sat in the golden glow of the study while the storm raged outside. They spoke of small things, the way Atlas preferred the heels of Arthur's expensive boots to his actual toys, and the puppy's newfound obsession with the gardener's prize-winning roses. With Atlas as the bridge, the invisible barriers between the high-born Duke and the forgotten girl began to crumble. Arthur shared stories of his childhood travels, and Clara, for the first time, spoke of her father, not the gambler he became, but the man who used to tell her that she was made of stardust and dreams. At one point, Atlas, finally exhausted by his own terror, fell into a deep sleep across Arthur's lap. The Duke made no move to displace him. "You have a gift, Clara," Arthur said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that always made her heart skip. "You see the broken things, and you don't look away. Most people look at this dog and see a nuisance or a toy. You saw a soul in need of sanctuary. You did the same for yourself, even if you don't realize it yet." Clara looked at him, her chest tight with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. I didn't give myself sanctuary, Arthur. You gave it to me. The use of his Christian name hung in the air, a daring bridge across the social chasm. Arthur didn't correct her. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the rug, before finally covering it. His skin was warm, his grip steady and grounding. I merely opened a door, he whispered. You were the one brave enough to walk through it. In that moment, as the rain turned to a gentle patter and the fire burned down to glowing embers, the Duke of Rothbury's icy exterior didn't just melt. It vanished. The man who sat before her was no longer a distant protector or a social titan. He was a man who found beauty in a stray dog and strength in a woman's quiet resilience. As they sat in the companionable silence, the only sound the soft snoring of the puppy between them, Clara realized that the arrangement that had brought her to Rothbury was no longer a matter of rescue or duty. It was becoming something far more dangerous and infinitely more beautiful. She wasn't just his ward, and he wasn't just her savior. Through the simple, honest needs of a small white dog, they had found a language that the tongue would never understand. The language of a heart finally finding its home. The golden isolation of Rothbury Hall was finally pierced by the sharp nibs of fountain pens and the frantic fluttering of ivory fans. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the tea tables of the countryside, the name Arthur Crane was being spoken with a mixture of awe and scandalized delight. The Duke, a man known for a temperament as immovable as the cliffs of Dover, had not only disrupted a private garden party, but had vanished into the night with a girl whom many had forgotten even existed. The ward of Rothbury had become the most tantalizing enigma of the season. At Whitby Manor, the atmosphere was far from inquisitive. It was poisonous. Lady Millicent sat at her escritoire, the scratching of her quill the only sound in a room that felt heavy with the scent of stale lilies and dying ambition. Before her lay a stack of invitations, or rather, the lack of them. Since the Duke's departure with Clara, the social invitations for her own daughters had slowed to a trickling stream. The Ton did not forgive a woman who had been publicly rebuked by a peer of the realm, especially one as influential as Rothbury. Millicent's eyes narrowed as she read a particularly pointed letter from Lady Jersey, which inquired with faux concern about the health and happiness of the dear stepdaughter who was now enjoying the Duke's legendary hospitality. Every word felt like a slap. To the world, Millicent was no longer the successful matriarch of a rising house. She was the cruel relative who had been humbled by a hero. "She will not be my undoing," Millicent hissed to the empty room, her fingers cramping around the pen. "The girl is a legal entity, a piece of property left in my care by a man who lacked the sense to see her for the burden she was." She reached for a fresh sheet of parchment, her mind churning with the cold precision of a merchant counting losses. To reclaim Clara was no longer just about having a servant. It was about reclaiming her own reputation. If she could prove that the Duke had acted impulsively, or better yet, improperly, she could force a return. She began to draft a letter to the family solicitor, Mr. Grimshaw, a man who specialized in the darker corners of estate law and the ironclad rights of guardians. She knew the Duke's weakness. He was a man of honor. If she could create a scandal, a suggestion that Clara's presence at Rothbury without a chaperone was an affront to the girl's fragile virtue, she could make the Duke's protection look like a kidnapping. She would claim that Atlas, that wretched, insignificant dog, had been a family heirloom stolen in a moment of distress. She would paint Clara not as a victim, but as a manipulative girl who had bewitched a duke into a momentary lapse of judgment. As she wrote, a jagged smile touched her lips. She would play the part of the grieving, misunderstood mother whose wayward ward had been snatched away. She would demand an audience at Rothbury, bringing with her the full weight of the law and the threat of a public inquiry that even a duke could not ignore without staining his name. While Millicent plotted her counteroffensive, the object of her malice was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. At Rothbury, Clara was learning the geography of her new life. She spent her mornings with the estate steward, learning the ledgers and the language of land management, a task Arthur had encouraged, much to the surprise of the household. "Knowledge is the only gown that never goes out of style," Arthur had told her as they sat in the sun-drenched library. Atlas sprawled across a patch of sunlight at their feet. Clara found herself blooming under the Duke's tutelage. The shadows under her eyes were gone, replaced by a brightness that made her chestnut hair seem to catch the fire of the sun. She moved through the halls of Rothbury with a quiet grace, no longer flinching at the sound of a raised voice or a heavy footstep. The staff treated her with a deference that she was beginning to believe she deserved. Yet, even in the sanctuary, whispers reached them. The morning post arrived with journals and letters that Arthur read with an increasingly dark brow. He saw the way the wind was blowing. He knew that Millicent would not slink away into the shadows of Kent. A woman like that lived for the light of social prominence and would burn everything down to stay within it. One evening, as the two of them walked through the topiary garden, the air thick with the scent of evening primrose, Arthur stopped near an ancient stone sundial. "The world is a noisy place, Clara," he said, his voice carrying a trace of the iron that usually remained hidden in her presence. "And it is currently very interested in you. My protection is a formidable thing, but even I cannot stop the tongues of London from wagging once they have caught the scent of blood." Clara looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Is she coming for me, Arthur?" He didn't lie to her. He never did. "She is making inquiries. She is speaking of legal guardians and family debts. She thinks she can use the law to drag you back to the cellar she built for you." Clara instinctively reached for the Duke's coat, which she had taken to wearing on their walks, the heavy fabric a familiar comfort. "I won't go back. I would rather walk into the sea with Atlas than spend another night under her roof." Arthur reached out, his hand steady as he cupped her cheek. The intimacy of the gesture was no longer shocking, but it was still profoundly moving. "You will not have to, but you must be prepared. She will not come with a slap this time. She will come with a contract and a smile that hides a dagger. We must give the ton something else to talk about, something so grand and so permanent that her claims will look like the desperate scrapings of a beggar." Clara felt the weight of his words. He was suggesting a move onto the grand chessboard of society, a way to seal her safety forever. As Atlas let out a playful bark, chasing a stray leaf across the marble path, Clara realized the peace of Rothbury was about to be challenged. The whispers of the ton were growing into a roar, and the battle for her future was no longer confined to a garden in Kent. It was moving toward the heart of the empire, where the stakes were as high as a duke's crown and as fragile as a girl's hope. The peace of Rothbury Hall was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, not by thunder, but by the sharp, rhythmic clatter of a carriage that bore no ducal crest. Clara was in the music room, her fingers tentatively tracing a melody on the grand pianoforte, while Atlas napped in a patch of sunlight at her feet. The sudden, frantic ringing of the servant's bell echoed through the stone corridors, a sound so discordant it made the puppy bolt upright with a low, protective growl. Clara stood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a storm she had hoped was left behind in the dust of Kent. When she reached the grand foyer, she found Arthur already there. He stood at the base of the staircase, a pillar of cold marble and suppressed fury. Opposite him stood Lady Millicent, flanked by a man in a soot-colored coat whose spectacles sat perched on a nose that seemed designed for sniffing out misfortune. This was Mr. Grimshaw, the Whitby solicitor, and he held a heavy leather satchel as if it were a weapon of war. Millicent looked different than she had in the garden. Gone was the panicked rage, replaced by a terrifying, polished composure. She wore a mourning veil of black crepe, despite her husband having been dead for years, a visual plea for the sympathy of any onlookers. "Clara, dear," Millicent said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet poison. "You look well fed. The Duke has been most charitable, I see." "What are you doing here, stepmother?" Clara asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain steady. She felt Arthur's presence behind her, a solid weight of protection. But the sight of the woman who had ruled her life for a decade still made her breath short. "I am here to correct a grievous misunderstanding," Millicent replied, gesturing toward the solicitor. "It seems that in your haste to flee your responsibilities, you forgot the legal realities of your father's estate." "Mr. Grimshaw?" The man stepped forward, clearing his throat with a sound like dry parchment. "Your Grace, I represent the interest of the Whitby estate. We have discovered a series of private bonds, unpaid debts of the late Viscount Whitby, Clara's father, contracted specifically to Lady Millicent's family for the girl's upbringing and maintenance. These debts remain unsatisfied." Arthur stepped forward, his eyes narrowing into slits of dark fire. "Speak plainly, man. What is it you are suggesting?" "The debt is substantial, Your Grace," Millicent interrupted, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "And by the terms of the late Viscount's private codicil, if the debt cannot be settled in coin, the guardianship of the daughter remains entirely at my discretion until she is 30. Since the money is gone, spent on her own vanity and care, I am here to exercise my right. Clara is coming home to fulfill her obligations to the family she has so cruelly abandoned." "She is not a piece of livestock to be traded for a debt," Arthur growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "In the eyes of the law, Your Grace, she is a ward with a lien against her future," Grimshaw added smoothly, pulling a document from his bag. "Unless, of course, the Duke of Rothbury intends to settle a debt of £5,000 for a girl who is, legally speaking, a stranger to him." The sum was astronomical, enough to buy a small manor. Millicent knew Arthur had the wealth, but she also knew his reputation for being a man of rigid principle. She bet that even a duke would hesitate to pay such a ransom for a girl whose reputation was already being picked apart by the London vultures. Clara felt a cold numbness spreading through her limbs. She looked at the document, the sprawling signature of her father, likely signed in a drunken stupor or under duress, staring back at her like a betrayal from the grave. This was the dagger Arthur had warned her about. Millicent didn't want the money. She wanted the power to drag Clara back into the dark, to prove to the world that no one escaped the Whitby reach. "I won't let you," Clara whispered, stepping forward. "The debt is a lie. I worked for you for years. I was your maid, your cook, your scapegoat. If there is a debt, I have paid it in blood and tears. A daughter's service is not a legal offset for a father's bond," Millicent snapped, the mask of the grieving widow slipping just enough to reveal the monster beneath. "You are coming back, Clara, or I shall have the Duke charged with the harboring of a fugitive ward. Imagine the scandal then. The great Duke of Rothbury, embroiled in a common kidnapping suit over a girl who isn't worth a farthing." The room went deathly silent. Atlas, sensing the tension, bared his tiny teeth at the solicitor, a small but fierce defense of the only home he had ever known. Arthur didn't look at the documents. He didn't look at Millicent. He looked only at Clara, his gaze searching her face. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the woman who had knelt in the dirt to protect a dog. £5,000, Arthur said finally, his voice echoing in the vast hall. Yes, Your Grace, Grimshaw said, sensing a victory. Paid in full, or the girl returns to Whitby Manor this evening. Arthur walked slowly toward Millicent. He stopped so close that she had to tilt her head back to look at him, her smug expression wavering under the sheer pressure of his proximity. You think you have found a loophole, Arthur said, his words falling like stones into a well. You think you can use the ghost of a dead man to cage a living soul. You are mistaken. I will pay the debt, Lady Millicent. Every last penny. Millicent's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to concede so easily. Then the bond is settled. But she is still my ward. Without a legal husband, I still hold the right to— I was not finished, Arthur interrupted. He turned to his own steward, who had appeared in the shadows of the hallway. Prepare the draft. But before I sign, Mr. Grimshaw will sign a full and final release of all claims, past, present, and future, against Miss Whitby. And Lady Millicent, you will sign a formal apology for the physical assault I witnessed in your garden, to be kept in my private safe as let us call it an insurance policy for your future silence. I will do no such thing, Millicent hissed. Then take her, Arthur said, his voice suddenly ice-cold. He stepped aside, opening the path to Clara. Take her and explain to the King's Bench why you are trying to enforce a bond that I will prove was fraudulent. I have 3 of the finest barristers in London riding for Rothbury at this moment. By the time this reaches a courtroom, I will have unearthed every debt, every secret, and every dark corner of the Whitby name. You will not only lose the girl, you will lose everything you have spent your life building. The silence returned, heavier this time. Millicent looked at Clara, then at the Duke's immovable face. She realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. Arthur wasn't just defending a girl. He was laying siege to Millicent's entire world. The money, Millicent whispered, her voice shaking with defeated greed. Give me the money, and you can have her. She was never anything but a burden anyway. Clara watched as the papers were signed, her breath returning in ragged gasps. When the solicitor and her stepmother finally turned to leave, Millicent paused at the door, her eyes burning with a hollow, impotent malice. You think you've won, Clara, she spat. But you're just a bought woman now, a Duke's expensive toy. Arthur didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. He watched them go, his hand resting on the hilt of his cane until the carriage wheels faded into the distance. When the hall was empty, Clara turned to him, the tears she had held back finally spilling over. Why? She asked, her voice a broken whisper. You could have fought them. You didn't have to give her the money. Arthur walked to her, his hands coming up to rest on her shoulders. He pulled her gently into the circle of his warmth. I didn't give her the money to buy your freedom, Clara, he said, his forehead resting against hers. I gave it to buy her absence, because I realized, while she was speaking, that I cannot protect you if I am busy fighting ghosts. I want your future to be clear of her shadow. As Atlas curled around their feet, Clara realized the Duke had just made the ultimate sacrifice for a man of his nature. He had chosen peace over the pride of a fight. He had paid a king's ransom not for a ward, but for the right to see the woman he loved breathe without fear. And in the quiet of the Rothbury foyer, the expensive toy realized she was something far more precious. She was home. The aftermath of the Duke's payment left a ringing silence in the grand hall, one that Lady Millicent attempted to fill with the bitter vitriol of a woman who had gained gold but lost her soul. She stood by the heavy mahogany doors, clutching her reticule as if it contained the lifeblood of the girl she had tried to break. Her eyes, cold and calculating, raked over Clara, taking in the sapphire silk of her gown, the healthy glow of her skin, and the small, white dog sitting protectively at her feet. "You think this is a victory, you miserable girl?" Millicent spat, her voice a low hiss that carried through the marble foyer. "You have simply traded one master for another. You were a servant in my house, and now you are a dependent in his. Without me to guide you, to beat the insolence from your bones, you will remain a nothing. A ghost in a finer shroud." Clara felt the old, cold, familiar dread start to rise in her throat, the instinct to lower her eyes and apologize for her very existence. But then, she felt a hand rest firmly on the small of her back. The warmth of Arthur's palm through the silk of her dress was like an electric current, grounding her, reminding her that the floor beneath her feet was no longer shifting sand. She took a breath, a deep, full breath of air that belonged only to her, and looked directly into her stepmother's eyes. For the first time, Clara did not see a giant. She saw a small, hollow woman clinging to the wreckage of her own cruelty. "I am not a ghost, Millicent," Clara said, her voice steady and clear, ringing out with a strength that made the Duke's hand tighten slightly in a gesture of silent pride. "And I am not a nothing. I was the one who kept your household from crumbling while you spent my father's memory on ribbons and lace. I was the one who cared for my sisters when you were too occupied with your own vanity to notice their tears." Millicent recoiled as if struck, her face contorting. "How dare you speak to me? I dare because you no longer have the power to stop me," Clara interrupted, taking a step forward, away from Arthur's protective shadow, standing entirely on her own. "You spoke of my father's debts, but you never spoke of the debt you owe me. The years of my youth you stole, the kindness you withheld, the bruises you thought I would forget. I have paid your imaginary bonds in full, but you will never be able to repay what you took from me." Atlas let out a sharp, decisive bark, echoing his mistress's defiance. Clara looked down at the puppy, then back at the woman who had once threatened to drown him. "You called me a burden," Clara continued, her gaze unwavering. "But the burden was always yours. You carried the weight of your own hate, and it has aged you. It has made you ugly in a way that no silk gown can hide. Look at this house, Millicent. Look at the respect I am shown here, not because of a title, but because I am a human being. You didn't just fail to break me. You taught me exactly what kind of woman I never want to be." Arthur stepped up beside her, his presence a silent, looming threat that underscored every word Clara spoke. He did not need to speak. The way he looked at Clara, with a mixture of awe and fierce devotion, was a sharper blade to Millicent's pride than any insult. "The carriage is waiting to return you to the station, Lady Millicent," Arthur said, his voice like the closing of a heavy book. "Every moment you remain on my land is an affront to my hospitality. I suggest you take your blood money and disappear. If I ever hear your voice directed at this lady again, or if a single rumor regarding her character finds its way to a London paper, I will not send a solicitor. I will come myself. And I promise you, you do not want to see the Duke of Rothbury when he is truly angry." Millicent's mouth worked soundlessly, her face a pale mask of impotent rage. She realized finally that the girl she had bullied into silence was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, backed by a man who would move mountains to preserve it. With a final, choked sound of disgust, Millicent turned on her heel and fled through the doors, her black mourning veil trailing behind her like the smoke of a burnt bridge. As the heavy doors groaned shut, sealing the Whitby influence out of Rothbury forever, the tension drained from Clara's body. She swayed slightly, the adrenaline of her defiance leaving her lightheaded. Arthur caught her, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective urgency. "That was," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion, "the most magnificent thing I have ever witnessed." Clara leaned into him, burying her face in his waistcoat, the scent of sandalwood and safety surrounding her. "I was so afraid," she admitted, her voice muffled. "Fear is not the absence of courage, Clara. It is the proof of it," Arthur said, pulling back just enough to tilt her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "You stood your ground. You didn't just defeat her, you reclaimed yourself. You are no longer the girl in the garden, hiding in the briars. You are the mistress of Rothbury, and I have never been more honored to stand beside anyone." Clara looked at him, seeing the truth of his words in the warmth of his gaze. She looked down at Atlas, who was now busy investigating a stray thread on the rug, completely unbathed by the drama that had just unfolded. "I am free," she whispered, the realization finally taking root in her heart. "You are more than free," Arthur corrected, leaning down until his breath brushed her lips. "You are loved, and that is a fortress no debt can ever breach." In the quiet of the hall, the shadows of the past finally dissolved into the golden light of the afternoon. Clara Whitby, the forgotten daughter, had found her voice, and in doing so, she had found the life she was always meant to live. The garden party was a lifetime ago. Her future, bright and vast, was just beginning. The transformation of Rothbury Hall was complete, not just in its decor, but in its soul. For the grand winter gala, the ancestral seat of the Cranes had been turned into a cathedral of light and ice. Thousands of wax tapers flickered in crystal chandeliers, their glow reflecting off the freshly polished marble and the vibrant greenery brought in from the glasshouses. The air hummed with the low, excited murmur of the ton. For tonight was the night the Duke of Rothbury would officially present his ward to the world. In the blue suite, Clara stood before the mirror, her breath hitching as she looked at her reflection. She wore the sapphire silk Arthur had insisted upon, a gown that deepened the color of her eyes and draped over her figure with the liquid grace of a mountain stream. Around her neck sat a single, breathtaking pendant, the Rothbury star. A diamond of such clarity it seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Atlas, now a healthy and rambunctious young dog, sporting a small silver collar, sat by the door, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor. He seemed to sense the gravity of the evening, watching Clara with an intelligence that often made her wonder if he knew he had been the catalyst for this entire miracle. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of the Duke. When Arthur entered, the room seemed to shrink. He was dressed in formal evening black, his chest adorned with the various orders and medals of his rank, looking every inch the formidable peer. Yet, when his eyes landed on Clara, the hardened mask of the statesman fell away entirely. "You are," he began, his voice thick and rough. "Utterly beyond words, Clara." "I am terrified, Arthur," she confessed, her hand trembling as she reached for her fan. "They will see me and they will remember. They will remember the girl in the faded muslin carrying trays." Arthur walked to her, taking both of her hands in his. His grip was warm, solid, and absolute. Let them remember. Let them see the girl they overlooked and realize their own blindness. You are not a secret to be hidden, but a treasure to be celebrated. Tonight, you do not walk as a guest. You walk as the heart of this house. The grand ballroom fell into a stunned silence as the master of ceremonies announced them. As Clara descended the staircase on Arthur's arm, she didn't see the judgmental glares she had feared. Instead, she saw a sea of faces tilted upward in genuine awe. She moved with a quiet, regal confidence, the years of servitude having forged a steel in her spine that no debutante could replicate. Throughout the evening, Clara navigated the complex waters of society with effortless grace. She spoke of literature with the scholars, of estate management with the lords, and of kindness with the dowagers. Beside her, Arthur remained a constant, protective presence, his gaze never straying far from her. Even the most cynical gossips were silenced. It was impossible to deny that Clara Whitby was exactly where she belonged. As the midnight hour approached, the music slowed to a romantic waltz. Arthur led Clara to the center of the floor, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. When the final notes faded, he did not lead her back to the dais. Instead, he stayed in the center of the room, his hand still holding hers. The Duke of Rothbury, a man who had never bowed his head to anyone but his sovereign, slowly lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. This was not a move for a puppy in a garden. This was a man surrendering his life to the woman he adored. "Clara," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent hall. "I once told you that I brought you here to watch you find your wings. I have watched you fly, and I have realized that the sky is empty without you beside me. I do not offer you my protection as a guardian anymore. I offer you my heart, my hand, and my life as your husband. Will you stay at Rothbury, not as my ward, but as my duchess?" The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Clara looked down at the man who had rescued her, challenged her, and loved her back into existence. She thought of the briars in the garden, the sting of the slap, and the cold loneliness of her past. Then she looked at the warmth in Arthur's eyes and the home she had found within them. "I have already found my home, Arthur," she whispered, her voice clear and resonant. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes." As he stood and pulled her into a kiss that defied every convention of the era, the ballroom erupted into applause. It was a celebration of a second chance, of a forgotten daughter who had become the brightest star in the firmament. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the lights had been dimmed to a soft glow, Arthur and Clara walked through the quiet halls toward the library. Atlas trotted happily between them, his silver collar jingling softly. They stopped by the hearth, where the embers were still warm. "You changed everything," Arthur said, pulling her close. "I thought I knew what power was. I thought it was land and titles. I was wrong. Power is the courage to be kind when the world is cruel. You taught me that." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, looking at the portraits of the ancestors on the walls. They no longer looked like stern judges. They looked like a family welcoming her home. "We rescued each other, I think." "In every way that matters," he agreed. In the sanctuary of Rothbury Hall, the girl who had once been slapped for holding a puppy was now the duchess of a kingdom built on love. The shadows of the garden were gone, replaced by the dawn of a new life. And as the moon climbed high over the Kentish hills, the forgotten spinster finally slept in the arms of the man who had knelt for her, knowing she was finally, irrevocably, home. My sweet family, Arthur paid a king's ransom to protect Clara's future. but all we ask of you is a simple subscribe and share. Somewhere out there, someone feels just as forgotten as Clara did in that garden. If you don't subscribe and share this video, they might never find the hope this story provides. Don't keep this light to yourself. Pass it on to someone who needs to know that their Duke is coming. Subscribe and share if you believe in true justice. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions. With love, the Victorian Royal Stories team.